On Sunday, the 5th of October 1794, Simon Byrne spent the day drinking with the local butcher John Hill in Paramatta. In the evening, they went to Hill's hut with some other men to keep drinking, while Hill's girlfriend started cooking a meal. Without any apparent provocation, Hill hit his girlfriend, and some of the men intervened to protect the woman. Hill grabbed a knife, and a chase ensued, at the end of which the butcher Hill stabbed Simon Byrne to death.
These are the blunders from down thunder that made Australia great.
Welcome to this episode of Blunders Down Under, laughable lessons from the past, in which we talk about dumb decisions from the past that have helped make Australia great. I'm Josh McGrath.
And I'm John Gibbs, and today we're talking about Simon Byrne, a convict with a violent past who arrived in Australia with the First Fleet and continued his violent life until its untimely termination.
So who was Simon Byrne?
Simon Byrne was born around 1757 and lived in the south of England. He was a stocking weaver by trade until he was arrested in 1783 and charged with highway robbery and theft of some money, a tin box and other goods. He was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted to 7 years transportation to America.
So what happened to him on the way to America?
Simon was one of 179 convicts on board the Mercury as it set out to sail to Virginia in March 1784. On the 8th of April, the convicts escaped from their chains, seized firearms from the first mate's cabin, and rushed upon the deck. After an hour of intense fighting, in which 3 people were killed, they overcame the crew of 25 and took control of the ship. The ship sailed back to England, where some of the convicts escaped, but others, including Simon, were recaptured.
So what happened after Simon got recaptured?
Some of the ringleaders of the mutiny were hanged, but most of the rest, like Simon, were imprisoned awaiting another opportunity to be transported to a faraway convict colony. After a few years of imprisonment on the prison hulk Dunkirk, Simon was transported to Australia, arriving at Port Jackson on the 26th of January 1788.
What happened when Simon arrived in New South Wales?
Simon married Frances Anderson, an Irish convict, on the 10th of February 1788, just 2 weeks after arriving in Australia. Fanny Anderson, who was born in 1758, had been sentenced to transportation for 7 years after being convicted of theft. 2 years after his marriage, Simon was promoted to a position in charge of a gang of labourers. Simon and Fanny both received tickets of leave, and in 1792, Simon was given a grant of land to farm. However, Simon and Fanny were regarded as being too fond of spirituous liquors to be very industrious.
And what sort of trouble did their drinking habits get them into?
Simon and Fanny often spent time drinking rum in the hut belonging to their friend John Hill, who was a butcher. One Sunday in 1794, the Reverend Samuel Marsden was walking past the hut and complained of the boisterous way in which they were behaving on the Sabbath. Simon told the Reverend where he could go, in no uncertain terms, and so Marsden called the police to arrest Simon and bring him before the magistrate.
What did the magistrate say when Simon was brought before him?
The magistrate at Paramatta happened to be Captain John MacArthur. Marsden asked that Simon be locked up until he became sober. However, John MacArthur happened to be the local rum trader, and Simon was one of his best customers. He ruled that Marsden's request was vexatious, and Simon was free to go. However, Hill, who was still a convict and not a free man like Simon, was found guilty of keeping a disorderly house and sentenced to hard labour at the government farm at Toongabbie.
What happened on the day of the murder?
A few weeks later, on the 5th of October, 1794, Simon and John once again spent the Sunday drinking rum, and as the afternoon wore on, they went to Hill's hut. Hill, who was known for being argumentative when he was drunk, was required to report to the government farm at Toongabbie the next day to continue his punishment. He was feeling resentful towards Simon, whom he blamed for having gotten in trouble, and he was feeling resentful towards his girlfriend, who didn't want to do the 1.5-hour walk to Toongabbie with him late at night in the rain.
How did Hill first show his resentment?
As Hill's girlfriend was trying to cook a meal, Hill struck her. Some of the other men in the hut intervened, giving the woman time to run away to hide in another hut. However, Hill soon found her and started dragging her out by her hair. One of the men again intervened to rescue the woman, and Hill then pulled out a knife, threatening to do murder. In the meantime, Simon had taken the woman into another hut, but Hill burst into that hut and stabbed Simon through the heart.
What happened after Simon was stabbed?
Simon staggered out of the hut, bleeding to death. He stayed alive long enough to identify the butcher as his murderer. The watchman, Thomas Gardner, was sent to arrest Hill. When he knocked on the door, Hill yelled out that he would serve him as he'd served the other man. Gardner broke down the door and seized the suspect.
What did Simon's friends do when it became time to bury him?
The planned time of Simon's burial on his farm was kept a secret from the Reverend Samuel Marsden, out of respect for Simon's antipathy towards him. However, Marsden did learn of the burial time by accident and hurried to the site to perform the funeral rites. Upon his arrival, he discovered that Simon's companions had buried him in what Marsden describes as the most beastly manner, after pronouncing the most horrid oaths, curses and imprecations over the corpse.
And what happened to Hill after the murder?
An inquest was held, during which Hill tried to blame the murder on one of the other men. However, the evidence against him was very strong, with several witnesses, the murder weapon being his own knife, and him being identified as the murderer by the victim before he expired. He was convicted of murder, and on the 16th of October 1794, just 11 days after murdering Simon Byrne, John Hill was executed.
And what about Fanny? What happened to her later in life?
Fanny was married again some 3 months later, this time to John Hambleton. The rest of her life was comparatively uneventful, and she died in 1837 at the age of 79.
What's the moral of this story?
If you're planning to have a drinking session, don't do it with a man who owns a big knife and has a grudge against you.